Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the September 2024 edition of the Southeast Monthly Climate Webinar, where we talk about the climate and special topics pertaining to the Southeast region. My name is Chris Furman. I'm the Deputy Director of NOAA's Southeast Regional Climate Center, and I'll be giving a climate overview of the past month. Our other speakers today are Todd Hamill from the Southeast River Forecast Center, who will provide a water resources update, Pam Knox from the University of Georgia, who will provide an agricultural impacts update. Joining us today, we're pleased to have Corey Davis from the North Carolina State Climate Office, who will be sharing some important updates to their fire weather portal for the Southeast. So again, thank you all for joining us. Just a reminder, type those questions and comments into the question box at any time, and we'll answer them at the end. Also, a recap email of this webinar will be sent out with a YouTube link to the recording here in the next day or so. All right, a lot to get to, so let's go ahead and jump into the climate. So over the past month, we see that mean temperatures were actually near average to slightly below average across much of the region. And part of this is due to the false fall that we experienced back towards the end of August, but since then, temperatures have been much more seasonal across much of the region. The exceptions, as you can see here, are Florida, especially from the I-4 corridor south, as well as the Caribbean, where temperatures have been several degrees above average over the past month. In fact, some locations are on track to record their warmest or one of their warmest Septembers on record. And this continues a trend of record warmth for these parts of the region that extends back over the past few years. Okay, next slide. So as is often the case this time of year, it's feast or famine in terms of precipitation across the Southeast. That was certainly the case over the past month, where a few tropical systems and a stalled frontal boundary brought heavy rain to many parts of the region. Hurricane Francine made landfall in Louisiana back on September 11th, bringing heavy rain to parts of Alabama, Georgia, and Tennessee. So some of the outer bands actually extended much further to the east. Muscle Shoals, Alabama, located not far from the Tennessee border, recorded over 9 inches of rain from Francine. And this is noteworthy, as Muscle Shoals had received less than a third of its expected rainfall since the beginning of summer. And remarkably, in just 3 days, Francine completely erased this deficit, which had been building over about a 4-month period. Many other locations across the region recorded 5 to 10 inches of rain from the 11th through the 15th as the remnants of Francine migrated northward. And not long after Francine made landfall, an area of low pressure developed off the southeast coast and tracked northward towards the Carolinas. What would eventually become potential tropical cyclone 8 dropped extraordinary amounts of rainfall across southeastern portions of North Carolina, most of which fell in a 12-hour period on the 16th of September. And we'll talk more about that storm here in a minute. And then we have Florida, which had to deal with a sort of a stubborn frontal boundary draped across the peninsula for much of the past month. Tampa, in particular, got off to a very wet start to the month with over 9 inches recorded in just the first 5 days of September, though since then they've only received a little more than an inch, but that looks like it's going to be changing very soon. So that's the feast. What about the famine? Well, that would be areas that missed out on the rain from these tropical systems and fronts, including much of Georgia, South Carolina, and the interior of the region from eastern Tennessee up to northern Virginia, where many locations recorded less than an inch of rain over the past month. And it was also relatively dry across parts of the Caribbean, though water resources continue to look good in the region due to all the rain that they've received, really going back to this past winter and early spring. Okay, next slide. Okay, so perhaps the biggest story of the past month was potential Tropical Cyclone 8, or PTC-8, which contributed to exceptionally heavy rainfall and catastrophic flash flooding across southeastern North Carolina last Monday, affecting many of the same areas that were impacted by Hurricane Debby just 6 weeks earlier. And much like Debby, PTC-8 moved very slowly and drew in considerable amounts of energy and moisture from a very warm Atlantic Ocean, as shown by the radar loop there on the left. It's courtesy of the Wilmington National Weather Service. The hardest hit areas were in Brunswick County, where rainfall totals ranged from a foot to over 20 inches along a narrow corridor beginning at Carolina Beach and Southport and extending northward along highways 87 and 17 and into eastern Columbus County. Rainfall totals from surface gauges and radar estimates are plotted there on the right. That map is courtesy of the North Carolina State Climate Office. Remarkably, most of this rain fell within a 12-hour period, with flash flooding in places like Carolina Beach, shown there in the middle of the slide, which recorded nearly 21 inches of rain. Several CoCoRaHS observers in Brunswick County reported over 15 inches, with an observer in Southport recording over 20 inches of rain. And a EcoNet station on Bald Head Island, that's maintained by the State Climate Office, also recorded over 20 inches of rain. Again, most of this falling within just about a 10 or 12-hour period. For context, these rainfall rates are expected to occur on average every 200 to 500 years, though some of the amounts that were approaching 18 inches over 12 hours have recurrence intervals of around 1,000 years. These are not far from the benchmarks that were set during Hurricane Florence back in 2018. And while the greatest rainfall amounts were down on the coast, heavy rain also extended inland across the Piedmont and even into portions of western North Carolina, where some places recorded 2 to 4 inches of rain. PTC8 also produced wind gusts over 50 miles an hour, with some places right on the water, like the famous Johnny Mercer's Pier there on Wrightsville Beach, recording gusts over 70 miles an hour. Okay, next slide. Okay, so over the past month, we've seen an expansion and intensification of drought across the interior of the region, especially in Alabama, Tennessee, and Georgia. And we've seen a reemergence of drought across South Carolina, which, as we saw earlier, really missed out on the rain from Francine and PTC8. Conditions over central and northern Alabama had actually gotten a bit worse in late August and early September, so in between the time of the two maps shown here. And the rain from Francine really did help replenish some of the moisture in those areas. And although I don't show it here, the Caribbean region continues to be free of any drought or abnormal dryness. This actually marks one of the longest such stretches in the region, at least according to the U.S. Drought Monitor, in over 6 years. Okay, next slide. So, if you like playing the La Niña waiting game, you're in luck. We're still playing it, as ENSO neutral conditions continue to prevail in the equatorial Pacific. Despite its slower than forecasted development, though, forecasters are still expecting La Niña to emerge, giving it a 71% chance over the next couple of months. From there, forecasters have upped the chance of it persisting through the upcoming winter, now at 80%, with the expectation now that it will probably be a weak event, which could certainly complicate the upcoming seasonal forecast and potential impacts. Okay, next slide. So as we look over the next 3 months, we actually see some hints of La Niña in the seasonal outlook, with above average temperatures favored across the southeast region, but we also see equal chances of above or below average precipitation. So we'll have to see how that plays out. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see in the Caribbean that above average temperatures and precipitation are expected through the remainder of the fall and as we get into the early part of winter. Okay, next slide. Looking at the seasonal drought outlook, we see that improvements are expected from the northern Gulf Coast through central portions of Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina, as well as western and northern portions of Virginia. On the other hand, drought is expected to persist across interior portions of the region, including northern portions of Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina, much of Tennessee, and extreme western portions of North Carolina and Virginia. At least for now, though, no new development is expected across the region, and this includes the U.S. Caribbean as well. Okay, next slide. So looking ahead to this weekend and early next week, above average temperatures and precipitation are likely across the region. And if we go to the next slide, we will see that this will be dictated largely by what happens to PTC9, which, as many of you know, officially formed in the Western Caribbean yesterday morning and is expected to become the next named storm Helene later today. Here we see the updated cone and rainfall forecast as of 8 a.m. this morning, and it shows a landfall somewhere between the western panhandle of Florida and the Tampa Bay area, probably Thursday night, as a major hurricane. Now, regardless of where it makes landfall, everyone along the Gulf Coast should be prepared for significant impacts. That includes storm surge, which could be as high as 15 or more feet across the Big Bend region, and hurricane-force wind gusts, which could extend well inland into parts of Alabama and Georgia. Tropical storm force gusts could also extend into parts of Tennessee and the Carolinas, so we need to be prepared for that. Heavy rain, though, will be a major problem with this storm, not just along the Florida Panhandle, but also inland, especially across parts of the southern Appalachians, where the topography will act to enhance the rainfall totals there. Some places are likely to receive over a foot of rain from this storm, maybe more, which will lead to significant flash flooding and potentially landslides in the mountains. Now, of course, these forecasts will continue to evolve over the coming days and coming hours even, so please check the National Hurricane Center website and especially check your local National Weather Service office to get more details on the expected impacts in your specific area. Okay, next slide. Okay, so looking out to later next week and into next weekend, we see a continuation of above average temperatures and above average precipitation. And next slide. We look ahead to next month, we see that above average temperatures are expected across at least the northern and southern ends of the region. In terms of precipitation, wetter than average conditions are expected across the southern and eastern ends of the region, with below average precipitation expected across the western portion of Tennessee. Okay, next slide. All right, so it's that time of year when we start to pay attention to the fall foliage. On average, much of the interior of the region will be at or just past peak color by the end of October. Earlier this month, AccuWeather released its fall foliage forecast for the country, and it shows mostly typical conditions, or I'm sorry, typical colors, I should say, across much of the southeast, except across parts of the southern Appalachians and eastern portions of Virginia and North Carolina, where the foliage is forecasted to be less vibrant than usual. If you want to find the most vibrant colors across the country, you got to look maybe across the Great Lakes and down through the lower Mississippi River Valley, at least according to the AccuWeather forecast. Okay, next slide. And along those lines, just a reminder that we, on our website, have a number of fall foliage resources for you to check out. So be sure to check those throughout the season, especially if you're planning a trip and want to check on the most up-to-date conditions. Okay, next slide. And finally, if you're interested in a summary of climate conditions and impacts from this past summer, check out our quarterly climate report for the region, which is available on our website. Also includes an expanded section on conditions in the U.S. Caribbean. And of course, all of our regional climate reports are available under the monitoring tab at the top of our webpage. And with that, the summary should be on the next slide. Yep, there it is. So summary for you to look at after the webinar. And with that, I'll turn it over to Todd for our water resources update.
All right, thank you, Chris. And so with all that being said, I'll kind of address how it's affected the rivers in the southeast. And so right now we're going to look at the 28-day average of where the rivers are for this time of year. And one of the things you'll notice as we talked about the feast or famine of getting rain and not getting rain, this is shown in the left-hand graphic with the USGS and the stream flows. And one thing with the stream flows during this time of year, this is typically for most of the southeast, except for Florida, their low time of year. This is the time of year when we would expect the lowest for all of the rivers across the southeast. And so to see it low in some places in Georgia and everything, it's extraordinarily low. And even though we are seeing some near normal to above normal across parts of the southeast, especially in Alabama and Tombigbee, we're in a drought there. And so even though our rivers are a little bit up, they're not that far up from where their low part is. So it's kind of deceiving in that way. So there is still a little bit of drought in there. So it is something we have to consider as we look at this and as we plan for the future and the storm coming up. On the right-hand side kind of tells how it's kind of gone back and forth all summer through the whole southeast, where early in the summer we were talking about drought and having issues through much of the southeast. But each of the tropical systems that's moved through during this time has kind of adjusted things. And we'll look very specifically at each region and see kind of how it's affected it. But you can see how we got very wet during the month of August and then have come back down and now are wavering in the normal category for the whole southeast. So let's go ahead and look at the next slide, which will talk a little bit about each of the different areas. So we'll start with Alabama. And Alabama, again, if you've seen the drought monitor, you can see that much of Alabama is still seeing either dry conditions or D1 conditions in those areas. And a lot of it is because we haven't completely recovered from the dryness that had occurred before that. We've been very warm, and so soils dry out very quickly. And so because of that, the rainfall that we've gotten, even though we did get a significant amount of rainfall, we didn't get much flooding in many of those areas, and that's partly because we were so dry before we started. So the cyclical nature on a week-to-week and month-to-month basis has made this summer a little bit different than I think past summers have been. It seems like there's usually a little bit more consistency, but I think that has a lot to do with how our tropical season has played out. Georgia is much the same thing. As we look at Georgia, and you see that we were very wet in that August timeframe, and a lot of that had to do with many of the South Georgia points, because our North Georgia points have been very dry. So once our South Georgia points kind of went back into their banks, things went back to normal through the whole state. So you can see how quickly it went up and came back down just because we dried out so quickly. And then Florida has stayed wet. As mentioned before, they had a frontal system that moved down there, brought some beautiful weather to the rest of the Southeast, but it kept raining and raining over Florida. And so they have stayed wet during this whole time. So they're, while it is their wet season, they are very vulnerable right now to any kind of tropical weather that we may end up with. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide and go up the eastern seaboard, and we'll start with South Carolina. And both South Carolina and North Carolina are great examples of this. The TC, the tropical cyclone, it doesn't always have to be named to have an impact on the Southeast, and that's exactly what happened here. It developed off of the coast of the Carolinas and then slowly moved inland and never really fully developed, but that didn't mean that it didn't pack a wallop with respect to rainfall. Fortunately, for those further inland, it didn't get as far inland and rain on them, but we did have some significant rainfall and some significant flooding in some of those areas. And so you can see, especially in South Carolina, it kind of skirted more of South Carolina and didn't get the heart of South Carolina as much as it could have. And so they have come back down and are almost down to below normal right now. North Carolina, they actually, for the state, next year when they show those averages, they've actually went above their high for that time of year. So that will look a little bit different next year, but they had some pretty significant rainfall during that time. Now we're back to normal. And the same for Virginia. Virginia is very similar to South Carolina only because they didn't get the bulk of that rainfall like North Carolina did. So while they got wet, they have fallen back down and are almost into that below normal. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide and see our current what we have in the Southeast as far as flooding goes. And from that TC8, we still have flooding. Because it's flat in there, it takes a long time for water to get through a lot of those systems. We continue to see some flooding, and we continue to see flooding in Florida, or at least action stages in Florida in some of those areas. Fortunately, we've had a little bit of time to dry out before this next system moves in. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So what I'm going to talk about here, after you've seen, is this is our model output, and this is using the different models. We use the NAIFS model, which is a Canadian model, and then the American model, and the NAIFS model is on the left. And what it does is it takes all the different possibilities of rainfall from the models, and it runs it through our river forecast system, and it gives us kind of an idea, a spread of where we might see some issues. And as you can see in the NAIFS model, over much of the Southeast, we have the chance of seeing some possible, a lot of minor flooding, possible moderate flooding, and major flooding. But again, this is just model output. We've not done anything from a forecaster standpoint. This is automatically run, but it kind of gives you an idea of where we might have some issues over the next 10 days as this moves forward. The difference between this storm, say, than the tropical cyclone 8 was it was a slow moving where it dropped a lot of rain over and over a longer period of time. This one, it should be very quick. There'll be rain ahead of it, especially along the mountains, and then this storm will move very quickly through the area. However, with very intense rainfall over some of these areas, we could see some flooding, and it could happen very quickly. So it's something we need to watch and something we need to pay attention to over the next couple days by listening to your local weather office in your area. So let's go ahead and go on to the next slide. And where we are in the climatology, this is the Southeast climatology. And while we're not in our major flood season, we are in the middle of our secondary flood season, which is our hurricane season. Again, as it was mentioned earlier a couple of times, is feast or famine. A lot of times during this year, if we're dry, unless we see tropical weather, and for the most part, we've seen that, and that's over most of the Southeast RFC area except for Florida. And so that's kind of what we've seen here. We've seen different areas get flooding, but it hasn't been as widespread as what we see during winter flooding. And we're in week 39 of the year, and we're starting to come off of that. In the next few weeks, we'll really should start to slow down as the tropical season starts to slow down, and we're in between that hurricane season and our recharge season, which comes this winter. So the next slide shows Florida, and we are at the peak. Oh, I forgot to change that. That's week 39 too. I moved it but didn't change it. But that's week 39, and this is kind of the peak of our Florida flood season. The wet season, it should start to wind down over the next 2 to 4 weeks, and tropical activity should start to wind down also, and things should start to quiet down just a little bit. And especially if the La Nina does show up, things should really start to dry out. They could flip a lot between now and December. So we will see what that looks like. And so that'll be something to watch. Let's go ahead and go to our next slide. And this just shows our forecast. And right now, because a lot of those areas, and because our tropical season is still active, and we still have, I think the peak of our hurricane season has already happened, but that peak between the mid-September to mid-October, we still get a lot of strong storms, and the potential is still there. And with an active season and warm waters, there's still a risk for river flooding. We're a little bit drier in most of those areas. And again, this flooding could all occur before October even starts, and then we could be quiet during that time. So, I think we still have to watch it very closely, but I think we have a better chance for flooding along the Gulf Coast and along the seaboard, simply due to the potential for tropical weather. And with that, I think that was my last slide, and then the overview, and we will pass it off to Pam.
All right, well, good morning, everybody, and I'm going to try to keep this short to make sure we give plenty of time for Corey. Some of the impacts we've seen for the recent conditions on agriculture, we have had, of course, those dry conditions, and that has led to the expansion of drought, as Chris mentioned. Hurricane Francine did hit Alabama and the very western part of the region with some wind gusts and rain of up to 4 inches, and I do recall that there were some showers that extended even into Georgia. I don't think it affected the cotton much because of the growing season, but that will certainly not be the case with the storm that we're expecting later this week. Potential tropical cyclone 8 provided some needed moisture to the Carolinas. Of course, some of those places just got washed away. I could not find very many negative impacts on agriculture. I know they have it there, hog production and sweet potatoes and so on. So if you have negative impacts on agriculture in the Carolinas due to potential tropical cyclone 8 in mid-September, please send them to me and I'll incorporate that into my report next month. Dry conditions did reduce hay production. A lot of farmers only got 2 cuttings of hay this year, which means they're going to be buying hay this winter or culling cattle or both. And a lot of them are also holding off planting winter grains like rye and wheat because it's just too dry for the seeds to germinate. Cooler temperatures have slowed the development of some diseases like white mold and spider mites, but still a lot of diseases and pests are causing issues. Fall crops do look pretty good. They've appreciated that cooler temperatures and they're doing quite well. So if we go on, Meredith, there we go. The impacts of Debbie, we talked a little bit about this last month. Of course, they're still coming in. The farmers are still assessing yield losses, which a lot of times they can't really determine until they do the harvest and they see how much less they got than they expected or what the quality is. So that's still underway. I did see an article that the estimated losses in Florida from Debbie range from about 94 million to about 263 million, just depending on what you're counting. That includes the value of things like aquaculture, but does not include all the stored fertilizer and feed, and it doesn't include the infrastructure associated with that. So there's a lot of losses in Florida. I know the losses in Georgia were at least that much, probably much more. And there was less damage in the Carolinas and some drought reduction because the storm did weaken there, but they did have some yield losses to peanuts and other crops as well. Again, a lot of that they cannot determine until after they harvest it and get a number at what their yield rate is and what the quality of the production is. If we go on, soil temperature right now is running pretty cool across most of the region. A lot of that has to do with being fairly wet and the cooler temperatures we've had until recently. You can see the soil moisture. For some reason, the 20-centimeter soil moisture wasn't showing on their website. They changed something. But it does show the dry conditions associated with the drought in places where did not get hit by Debbie, which obviously shows up along coastal Georgia, or PTC 8, which shows up in the Carolinas. And so this reflects pretty well what we're seeing with the drought monitor status. We go on. Growing degree day accumulations still continuing to go. It slowed down a bit because of the cooler temperatures in earlier September. You can see it kind of dipped down. It's still above last year and not quite as high as the historic average, but I think most things are doing pretty well. You can see that a lot of the region was actually above normal for the last 30 days. The deviation is shown there in the map, with the exception of the mountainous areas. And this is from agroclimate.org. We go on. Flash drought. Last month we were talking about flash drought in Alabama. It's not there anymore. Now the looking forward forecast is really showing the potential for flooding, the potential for heavy precipitation. A lot of this is associated with potential tropical cyclone 9, which will be Helene probably sometime later today. We go on. Just wanted to talk about one aspect of Helene that I'm thinking about a lot, and I know a lot of farmers are as well. Cotton production across the Southeast has been going wide out. You can see this table shows the percent of the cotton bolls that are open. Everywhere it's above 60%. Usually 60% is when they start to defoliate the cotton. They take the leaves off it, makes it easier to harvest, and they get cleaner cotton because they don't have the leaf fragments in there. So a lot of places have started to defoliate, but you can see the percent that's harvested is actually very small. So the bolls are very susceptible to damage from wind and heavy rain losses. Anything above 2% can cause significant quality issues for the cotton. You saw the forecast map from Chris. We're talking about 4 to 6 inches across most of Georgia. So this is going to be a huge concern for cotton farmers. I'm really concerned about that. A lot of these farmers are still paying off loans from Hurricane Michael, you know, and they've had Debbie and more of the eastern part of Georgia and up the coast, and they've had some of these other storms as well. So this is going to cause tremendous amounts of damage. And honestly, there's not a lot that can be done at this point, because if the cotton is out in the field, it's probably not dry enough to harvest yet. I'm sure if they can harvest it, they will be today and tomorrow. But it's something that we're really going to have to watch carefully, and we'll be talking about this more in next month's webinar. So I think that might be my last slide. Yeah, here we go. Here's the summary. You can look at that later. And now it is my privilege to introduce Corey Davis from the North Carolina State Climate Office, who's going to talk about the fire weather portal and do a demo for us. So take it away, Corey.
All right, thank you so much, Pam. While I'm getting the slides up here, I will quickly introduce myself. Again, I am Corey Davis with the North Carolina State Climate Office. I'm one of our assistant state climatologists, and over the past 15 years or so, I have been the main developer for the Fire Weather Intelligence Portal. So I know there's probably folks on the call today that have not heard of or used the portal before. If you're in that group, my goal is to help you understand what the portal is, how it can be used for monitoring conditions, especially fire danger conditions across the state you're in and across the entire region. And if you're on the call and you have used the portal before, I hope that this morning we'll be able to highlight some of the changes and updates that we've made pretty recently so that you're aware of those and the capabilities that they offer. So I will say I am very glad to finally be joining you all on this webinar. Chris and Meredith reached out about a year ago and asked if I would consider presenting about the portal. At that time, we were just starting to work on this latest round of updates. So I asked if they would mind waiting a little longer before those updates were finished. And that's the point where we're at now. We are actually just beginning our regional re-rollout of the tool and these changes. So you all are the first audience that's really getting a close look at what we've done. So I thought it might be useful to start with a brief history, a timeline of the portal, where it's come from, why it exists, and then where it's at now. So the original inspiration really goes back to the 2008 fire season in North Carolina. That spring and summer, there were several fairly long, large wildfires, particularly in the eastern part of the state. And the North Carolina Forest Service came to us at the state climate office after those events, and they told us about some of the challenges that they had had. In particular, when these fires are going on, they need good, up to the minute weather information so they can see things like wind direction and wind speed, how that's changing and how that may affect the spread of fires. Also, they need good fire danger information and estimates from across the state, and they really just didn't have the coverage of that information they wanted. In addition, to get all of that information, they had to go to 2 or 3 different websites at least, so it wasn't as easy as they would like. So they asked us if we could build a tool online where they could get that information. The first step of that was just building out our monitoring network in North Carolina. So the map on the left here shows back in 2011 what the state of that fire danger monitoring network looked like. All of the black triangles that you see on the map here were RAWS weather stations. These are stations that are operated by the Forest Service or one of their partner agencies. And you can see we had a decent number in North Carolina, but there were still some pretty big gaps between stations. And as we've seen in recent years, fire danger can often be very localized. You can have some spots where conditions can be a lot worse than other areas. So we really wanted to increase the density of stations across the state. And there was one relatively easy way that we could do that. At the Climate Office, we operate our own network of stations called the North Carolina EcoNet, and they measure all the same things as those RAW stations with one small exception. The RAW stations have a wind sensor at 6 meters or about 20 feet above the ground. So we went to all 40 some of our EcoNet stations, added one of those 6 meter, 20-foot wind sensors, and suddenly they met the RAW standard and the National Fire Danger Rating System standards. So just by adding one sensor to each station, we had basically doubled the monitoring capacity in North Carolina. So after that, over the next couple of years, we worked on the first version of the fire weather portal. And in the summer of 2013, we launched that just for the state of North Carolina. You can see in the map on the left, it was just containing data from North Carolina, both from those RAW stations and from our EcoNet stations. And you can see, especially in the eastern part of the state, that increased density that we were able to achieve by bringing in our own sites. Along the coastline, very good coverage of stations in that area. I thought this would be a good time to briefly mention exactly where this data is coming from as far as the fire danger information goes. So between all of these weather stations, they feed their weather observations into a national database called WIMS. This includes their temperatures, their precipitation, including the 24-hour total precipitation, those 6 meter winds that we talked about, solar radiation, several parameters like that. And then every afternoon, when the 1 o'clock observations come into WIMS, it runs that data through some very detailed calculations that are part of the National Fire Danger Rating System. And this is where we get that fire danger output that's shown in the tool. So there's a lot of different information and variables available here. Some of those relate to the risk that a fire might start or how quickly it might spread. Some of those other variables are looking at how difficult a fire might be to contain or to mop up from if it does begin. That's the case for the Keach-Byram Drought Index, or KBDI, which you see on the map over here. This is one of the more popular fire danger indicators, but it's not really showing you the risk that a fire might start. Instead, it's related to the amount of dryness in the environment. So if a fire does start, how difficult would it be to contain and clean up from that fire? And then finally, there are a number of fuel moisture parameters. And when we talk about fuel moisture in a fire context, we're really just talking about natural things that burn. On the low end, you have very small diameter fuels like pine needles and small sticks and twigs. Those will both uptake moisture pretty quickly, but also lose that moisture pretty quickly. Sometimes we'll call those 1 hour or 10-hour fuels because that's the time that it takes to gain or lose that moisture. Also, we have larger fuels. These are your branches and fallen logs, very large in diameter. Obviously takes them longer to uptake moisture, but also they'll store that moisture for a little bit longer. So we sometimes call those 100 and 1,000-hour fuels. Just wanted to make sure you're familiar with those terms as we see them looking through the portal. So again, we launched the first version in 2013. It worked really well just for North Carolina for several years. What we found is that as we were giving presentations and showing the portal, if folks from other states were there, they were asking us how they could get this expanded to cover their state. And we finally had an answer for that in 2017 when the USDA Southeast Regional Climate Hub agreed to support a region-wide expansion across the 13-state U.S. Forest Service Southern region. On our end, on the development side, this meant bringing in the weather station observations from those states, also their fire danger estimates from the RAW stations in those states, and then expanding some of our gridded and forecast products to cover those other areas in the broader region as well. So again, by 2017, we did our first region-wide rollout and expansion for the portal. And then what's happened over the last 6-7 years since then is really a lot of innovation, especially here in North Carolina. We've been fortunate to have an ongoing partnership with the North Carolina Forest Service, and they've really been a leader in the region and in the country on fire danger monitoring and visualization. And this is one good example of that. In 2018, this was a new idea that was put into the state fire danger operating plan for how we could present and communicate fire danger across the state. And instead of looking at individual stations, it's grouping those stations into county areas, which are called fire danger rating areas. These areas share similar climate and similar geography. And basically, it's a good public-facing way of being able to share what the fire danger is like in different regions across the state. If you ever drive by a state park or a national forest, any venue like that, and they've got the Smokey the Bear sign out front, where it's showing that fire danger ranging from low to high to extreme, that's exactly what you're looking at here. We call it the adjective rating because it's just a good description of what that fire danger looks like. And again, we're now doing that for fire danger rating areas across the state. I'll mention that there is still a lot of value at having those local stations, and certainly having more stations helps make for better estimates for those local fire danger rating areas. But what we found is that, no pun intended, it was hard to see the forest for the trees. If you had a dozen stations in one corner of the state, you could very easily see what the local conditions were like, but if you zoomed out a little bit, it was harder to tell exactly what that danger was like at a regional scale. So that's why the fire danger rating areas ended up becoming so useful and have been so prominent for North Carolina over these past few years. So along with innovating new displays like this and bringing on some new data sets for North Carolina, we realized that this is information that was too good just to keep to ourselves. We wanted to make sure that the rest of the region had access to it as well. So over the past year, we've been working on these region-wide updates that include pushing things like fire danger rating areas all across the Southeast. And that's the point where we're at now. Just over the past few months, we've finished up those updates. They are now accessible online, ready to share. So for the rest of my time this morning, I wanted to walk through what the tool looks like, what it can do, and some of the updates that we've made over the past few months. So I've broken these examples into some specific applications ranging from a pretty basic level up to a more advanced level. We'll start off with the basic level. I will note quickly that if you've used the Fire Weather Portal before, you may have gone to a slightly different web address than this. The existing portal is still located at our website /FWIP. It'll continue to live there for a few more months, but eventually, once the rollout is complete, we'll fold that old site into the new one, which is at this address, which is our website /fire. So again, just something to be aware of if you're an existing user of the portal. But I wanted to start off with, again, this basic application, which is just maintaining situational awareness about what conditions are like in your area. This is not necessarily related to monitoring fire danger. And in fact, you don't have to be a fire manager to use the portal for this. You can just use it to keep an eye on what conditions are like right now, see how those conditions have changed over the past few hours and days, and then also pull up some data from recent and historical events. So with that said, I will switch over to the portal for our first demo here. Naturally, one thing you may want to check anytime you're about to head outside is what the temperatures are looking like. So we'll come down under the weather station data menu on the left side here. I'll note that we have slightly reorganized the data sets compared to how they were before. Previously, everything was listed in one drop-down, which made it really cumbersome to find exactly what you wanted. You can see now we've grouped things by weather parameters, precipitation totals. A little further down, we have some of those fire danger indicators. So again, it's a little bit easier to find exactly what you want. But in this case, we'll start off by looking at our current air temperatures from across the state and across the region. For the most part, across North and South Carolina and into Virginia, we're looking at temperatures in the mid to upper 60s to low 70s right now. If we head a little bit further west, we'll see we start actually getting into some upper 50s out across northern Arkansas, Oklahoma, up in the panhandle of Texas as well. But again, this shows the pretty widespread level of coverage we've got with weather observations across the region. There's a pretty good chance that there's a station near you in the portal and on this map. Another thing we may want to do is see how those conditions have changed recently. So we can click on any of these stations, click the link here to view more data, and that'll pull up a panel below the map. So on the left side here, we've got a summary of what this station is, where it's located, and then also what its current conditions are like. For instance, what the latest hourly observation was, what the recent precipitation totals over different time periods look like, and then also what some of those recent fire danger indicators and forecasted conditions have been at this site. And then also we've got our graph here. We call this our meteogram. This is basically just a graph of the history of the weather parameter that we're looking at for this location. So here we're looking at the last 7 days of hourly temperatures. It's pretty easy here to see exactly when the warmest conditions were, also when some of the coolest hours were. And then at the end of the chart here on the right, we can see what those recent conditions have been, how things have varied just so far this morning. So again, that's a quick look at what we can do with current conditions. There's lots of other data sets available. For instance, we could pull up the current radar imagery if we wanted to see where it's raining at the moment. Right now across central and eastern North Carolina, we've got a good band of rain moving through central Tennessee as well. So again, all of that data is available here under current conditions. You'll note that we have a couple other time periods available as well. One of those is forecast conditions. This is mainly used if you're planning ahead, especially looking to see what wildfire risk may look like over the next few days, or if you're planning a prescribed burn event. The other period we've got is past conditions. And this is useful if you want to look back at a previous event, whether it was last week or 5 years ago, or any time in the recent past. And often fire managers are using that to compare current conditions with notable events in the past when, for instance, they know they had some wildfire activity. In this case, we're actually going to use past conditions not to show a dry time, but a pretty wet time. If you remember from Chris's presentation, he talked about earlier this month, we had a couple pretty big rain events. So let's take a look at some of the 7-day rainfall totals from the middle of September and see what some of those actual amounts looked like. So again, we've changed our date here to last Wednesday afternoon. We'll look at the 7-day totals and display those on the map. Very easily here, we pick out some of those higher totals associated with potential tropical cyclone 8 down in southeastern North Carolina. There's one of those 21-inch values that Chris had mentioned. And we see over a fairly broad area, we had totals of at least 4 inches down across the southeastern part of the state. If we now pan a little bit farther south and west, we also see those areas in South Carolina that picked up little to no rain from that system, with less than a tenth of an inch in total over that weekly period. Same thing up across northern Georgia and across eastern Tennessee, some pretty dry conditions over that 1 week period. But then as we get down to the Gulf Coast area, we get some of those higher values from Francine, 6 to 8 inches down here in southeastern Louisiana. So again, really interesting to see those local conditions and those local variations in the totals. I know last week when that PTC 8 was moving through, I had the portal pulled up just to see what those amounts were looking like hour by hour. And it was amazing. Sometimes they were going up 3 or 4 inches in an hour in some of those wettest areas. So if you come across a map in the portal that you think is so amazing, you just have to share it. There's a couple ways that you can do that. One is if you want to send a direct link to this exact page view, you can click on the Show Link button up in the top menu. You'll see this text box is filled with a long page link. You don't have to write that whole thing down. Just click the copy button. That link will get copied to your clipboard, and you can paste that into an email or a presentation or wherever you want to share the link to this page. The other way we have of saving and sharing this information that's new on the current portal site is an ability to screenshot with just one click. Down in the lower right corner of the map here, we've got this camera icon. If you just click that button, it'll save a screenshot to your computer. And then if you pull that up, you can see it is nicely saved with the map and the legend and the title of the page here as well. So good graphics if you want to put those into presentations or in any sort of summary that you're putting together. Again, that's a new feature that we've got on the current portal site. So I will switch back to the slides here, and we will go into the next set of applications. And those are based around connecting what we're seeing with these weather conditions with fire danger and potential fire activity. First, we'll start off by looking at some of that recent precipitation data, but within a climate context. So are certain areas wetter or drier than normal for this time of the year? Then we'll look at some of the current fire danger estimates and also look at what some of those fire danger rating areas across the region are showing. So switching back to the portal site again, we've got a fresh page here to look at. We'll scroll down a little bit. You can see on the menu on the left here, we've got options to control the region that we're seeing on the map. We've got some reference layers, like if you want to turn county lines on or Forest Service regions on, those are available here. You can change the date and time that we're looking at in terms of the data on the map. We've got those weather station data layers. And then down, one thing we haven't looked at yet is these spatial and gridded layers. A lot of this is coming from, as we saw earlier, radar imagery. As we'll look at now, radar-based precipitation totals. And for the forecast conditions, it's a lot of computer model forecasts and analysis. So in this case, let's take a look at our percent of normal rainfall over the past 30 days. And this will give us a good idea of the areas that have been pretty wet because of those recent storms, and also the areas that have missed out on that rainfall. In North Carolina, we see central and eastern parts of the state have been pretty wet, especially from PTC 8 a week ago. A little further west in the region, a lot of that rain from Francine showing up on the map here across Mississippi, Alabama, parts of Louisiana, Tennessee. But you can see in between, here's that same area that was pretty dry over that mid-September week, is also pretty dry for the past month. A lot of areas showing below 25% of their normal precipitation. And if we want to hone in on exactly what's happening at a current location, we can just click a point on the map. We can see parts of North Georgia are down below 6% of their normal precipitation here over the past 30 days. So this is our first way of making that connection. We realize that these areas in South Carolina, North Georgia, Tennessee, far southwestern North Carolina are all pretty dry over the past month. So what does the fire danger look like at those areas now? Well, there's a few different data sets we could check for that. We've already talked about the Keach-Byram Drought Index. So let's pull up the current weather station estimates for KBDI. I'll note that these estimates are from yesterday afternoon. Like I mentioned, all of the station data goes into WIMS at 1 o'clock every day. So before about 2 p.m., you'll be looking at yesterday's data. After about 2:15, when we get that current information in, this map will switch over to showing today's latest data. But we do see a lot of these stations showing values in the 600 to 700 range. You see KBDI has a scale going from 0 to 800. So anything above 600 or 700 is pretty high on that scale, especially for this time of the year as we're getting into the fall. If we wanted a second opinion to see, this station, I don't know if I believe that high value, we've actually got an option for that. Under our gridded and spatial data, we've now got a gridded KBDI product. Now, we've had a product like this on our existing fire weather portal for several years, but a lot of folks had noticed that it didn't always agree perfectly with the point data. We've updated this gridded data set and its calculations over this past summer, and it seems like it does a lot better job of lining up with what we're seeing with those point estimates. And you can see that on the map here. A lot of those same areas are showing those gridded values in the 600, 700 plus range. And again, if we wanted to, we could click any of those values on the map and see exactly what it's showing based on this latest data set. So one last thing we can look at, we've seen the point estimates, we've seen the gridded estimates. We can also look at the fire danger rating areas that I talked about earlier, and we'll see how those are now available for all of North Carolina and all of the Southeast. Under the weather station data menu, we'll click on this aggregate by fire danger rating area option, and again, pick our KBDI data set. And this is exactly what we were looking at earlier for North Carolina. We've got the fire danger rating areas for the other states added in here as well. And again, you think about this as our public facing communication. If you wanted to tell people in Georgia where the highest fire danger, or at least if fires start, where they may be the most difficult to control. These are the regions that we're looking at: central and northern Georgia, same in Tennessee, central and eastern Tennessee, southwestern North Carolina as well. And then one other feature we've added recently is the ability to click on one of these fire danger rating areas, click this view more data link, and then that'll pull up this panel at the bottom that includes this graph. And this is showing over the past 7 days what this particular indicator, the Keach Fire and Drought Index, looked like for all of the fire danger rating areas in this state. And we've clicked in North Carolina. So that showed that this Southern Highlands region has steadily been the highest values of KBDI over the past week. We also see that really since last Wednesday or Thursday, those values have been creeping back upwards again. And we see how that compares to all the other fire danger rating areas in the state. You'll notice that the page just kind of refreshed in the background. That's another feature. If you're looking at current conditions, every 10 minutes, it'll automatically attempt to reload with the most current data. So again, just a way of making sure that we're always serving up the latest available information in the tool. So let's go back to one final set of applications now. And this is going to be a little bit more advanced. This will build on some of what we've already looked at, some of those dry areas where we know the KBDI is high. We'll look at some other indicators that may tell us whether there's concern for potential wildfire activity. And then we'll also look at the forecasts to see whether that level of concern may change over the next few days. And then also I'll briefly highlight some of the other forecast products that can look at things like dispersion and smoke hazards. Before we get into this application on the tool, I wanted to give a quick introduction to a data set that I'll talk about here. A lot of folks are probably not familiar with this, but I've become a big fan of this indicator just over the past few years. It's called the Denska Index. It was developed by a couple guys at the Southern Area Coordination Center. Their names were Denver Ingram and Kevin Skasny. They took 3 letters of their own names, stuck them together to make the name of this. But essentially what it is a combination of several existing known fire danger indicators, things like your minimum relative humidity. We know that when the air is less humid, that tends to increase the risk of fire. Your vegetation's drying out more in those cases. We also are looking at those fuel moisture conditions from the larger fuels, and then some of those other fire behavior indicators. The burning index, the energy release component, all of those are telling us something about what the activity may be like if a fire starts. So we add up each of these component indicators, and that gives us a value that tends to range somewhere from 0 to 100. And just like your report card in school, a higher value means you're in a lot better shape than a lower value. And what Denver and Kevin found is that once those Denska values dropped below about 35, they were seeing a significant increase in actual observed fire activity. And we've seen something very similar in North Carolina over the past few years. We'll look back to last fall. It was pretty dry in the western part of the state in October and November. And there were 3 different days when we had those Denska values down at or below 35. Each one of those days, we either had new fires that were starting or existing fires that were spreading over a broader area. So again, I've been very impressed with Denska in the applications that it has, just with one number to be able to tell you a lot about potential fire dangers. So I hope I can sort of spread the good word about this on the call this morning. So we'll switch back to the portal and let's pull Denska up. It's under our daily fire danger indices in the list here. And again, we're going to look for values that are at or below about 35. That's going to tell us where that potential risk could be of fire activity. And immediately we see a couple spots down in Georgia. There's one site just south of Athens where we have a value of 35. Again, this was an estimate from yesterday afternoon based on the fire danger indicators then. But then another site in northwestern Georgia where the value is even lower, down to 27 here. So immediately that should sort of cue your brain. These are 2 spots where we might be worried about fire danger activity today because those values have been so low. Another thing we can look at to tell us something about potential activity is soil moisture conditions. This is also a new data set we've added to the portal recently. This comes from NASA as part of their SPORT product. It's essentially a model-based estimate of soil moisture based on recent precipitation, but we found it does a pretty good job of highlighting some of the dry spots and looking at the soil moisture percentiles across the region. We again see those same areas in northern Georgia, in eastern Tennessee, all showing pretty dry soils at the moment. Chances are if there's dry soils, then the vegetation there is really not uptaking very much moisture. So that vegetation may be dry and ready to burn as well. So again, a lot of confirmation from what we've seen on the other indicators here, really confirming some of these as potential hotspots, so to speak, for fire activity. We can also look at the forecast to see how that may change. So in this case, let's take a look at that energy release component. Again, this is more of a fire behavior indicator. It tells us something about if a fire were to start, how much energy might be released by those burning fuels based on their current level of dryness. So when we look at this map, we see most areas in the Carolinas and surrounding states are in the low to moderate range today. This is this afternoon's forecast, but we do still have some higher values here and there. I wanted to zero in on this station in northwestern Georgia that was showing those very low DENSCA values. Let's take a look at what its ERC looks like over the past month or so, and then also over the next 7 days. This is kind of a busy graph here, so I'll go through one line at a time and explain what it's showing. First off, the black line here is the daily estimated energy release component values for over the past month. We can see when we had some of those higher values in mid-September, how those dropped off after some of the rainfall in the middle of the month, but how they've been creeping back upward recently. The purple line here will show the forecast. So in the past, this shows us what that day's forecast looked like. And then in the future, this shows us what the daily forecasts are like for the next 7 days. One thing to note here is how in recent days, the actual daily estimates have been higher than what the forecasted values were. That's really important for a fire manager to take note of, because this tells them this is a spot to keep an eye on. It's been running higher than predicted, so that fire danger may be a little bit worse than they expected there. We also see from the forecast that today is really the last day with higher values this week. After that, with some rain moving in, we're expecting a drop off in those values over the rest of that 7-day period. The other two lines on the graph here are really historical reference markers. This shows as the red dotted line, the historical daily maximum value for each day of the year. And then the blue dashed line is the historical daily average. Keep in mind, this station and many in the portal have a pretty short period of record, only 4 years at this site, but still you can tell something about where the current values stand in related to the recent past. And in this case, we've seen basically record high new daily maximum values set over the past 4 to 5 days at this station. So still running above the average, running near new maximum values. That's still really useful information for a fire manager to have. One last thing that I'll highlight while we're looking at the tool here is some of our model-based forecast products. We'll look at, this is from the National Weather Service's National Blend of Models. And I wanted to highlight just one of these, the Low Visibility Risk Index. This is often more useful for prescribed burning. So if you're planning a burn, you might want to know whether that smoke is going to get trapped near the ground level and may cause visibility concerns. You see on this scale, we're going from 1 to 10, with 1 being the lowest chance of having low visibility, 10 being a pretty high chance of low visibility. Most of the region, at least around the Carolinas and yes.
I'm sorry, just flagging that we're almost at time. For those of you who can stay on, please do. We'll also send the full webinar recording. So carry on, Corey. And if you have questions, put them in the question box and we'll make sure that they get answered even after the webinar. Thank you.
Yes,
Sorry for interrupting.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for the time update. Yeah. Just to wrap up with this this indicator, again, we're seeing in most areas, we're really not too concerned about low visibility this afternoon. But if folks up in Virginia are either planning on doing any prescribed burns, or if there were to be any wildfire activity there, you see this is a pretty high chance of low visibility. We can look at some of these points and see what those values are. That's an 8 out of 10. So probably not a great day to be burning up in the mountains in Virginia. But again, this is one of those useful tools, especially for planning prescribed burns. You can look at the forecast and see what those conditions are showing. So I'll come back and just wrap up with a few basic summary points. Thinking about the history of the Fire Weather Portal, it was initially designed to assist the North Carolina Forest Service with their own monitoring. Over the years, we've expanded it across the Southeast, and now it's pretty widely used to help folks across the region with monitoring and with planning for fires and prescribed burns. I like using the slogan, it's decision support driven by sound data. What that means is that the portal is not going to make a decision for you. It's not going to tell you where to cut a fire line. It's not going to tell you whether to put a torch to the ground to start a prescribed burn. but it can use that good data that we're collecting from across the region to help you make better informed and more sound decisions. I highlighted a few of the new features that we've added over the last few months, some of those new data export options, for the new gridded data sets, including that updated gridded KBDI product, and those fire danger rating areas across the entire region now. And as you noted from the introduction, the development has never stopped with this tool. There's always new ideas, new data coming online. So that development is going to keep going over the next few months and years. We have some big plans for other features to add. One that I'm really excited about is being able to click on one of those gridded forecasts, like we just saw for the low visibility risk index, and seeing the hour by hour forecast over the next few days. I think that'll be really powerful. We also want to bring in some other reference data sets like current satellite detected fires and smoke plumes. Lots of other ideas out there as well, but that's enough in terms of content for now. One last quick plug. If you want to learn more about the Fire Weather Portal, we have another webinar coming up next Monday afternoon that's being hosted by the U.S. Forest Service. This is going to be a little bit more technical than what we covered today, more specifics about some of the data sets, really intended more for state fire managers, regional and district foresters. But if you're in that group and you want to learn more, feel free to register to join us next Monday afternoon. So that's all for me. Like Meredith said, if you had questions, feel free to add them in the chat or also send me an email. And hope if you have a chance, you'll take a look and explore the updated Fire Weather Portal. So thank you.
That is fantastic, Corey. I'm applauding here for you and your team. Some really powerful but easy to navigate and understand capabilities. This is going to be an enormous contribution to managing fire risk across the region. So again, thank you. We are at time. We don't have any questions right now, but we do have a lot of kudos for the new fire portal, and we'll send that to you. Just a reminder, this webinar series is held every month, co-organized by the Weather Service, NIDIS, and the Southeast Regional Climate Center. Our next webinars will be October 22nd, where you'll hear from Pam Knox on a review of the 2024 growing season, and then to find out if ENSO has in fact changed, then join us on November 19th for our winter outlook. We'll still stay on the line for a couple moments if there are any additional questions, but I just want to give a huge thank you to all of our presenters who join us every month, and especially Corey, who joined us today. And if you have any questions or comments following this, please feel free to reach out. We're always trying to improve this webinar. I don't see any more questions coming in right now. So with that, I will just end this. Wish you all a wonderful day and look forward to seeing all of you next month on October 22nd. Thank you.